All right, today we're going to tackle something different. We're diving into a unique and, frankly, unconventional perspective on how to achieve peace in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This comes directly from a text that lays out a philosophy called the New Science. Our job here is just to walk through its core arguments, step by step, and see what this framework proposes. So right out of the gate, this is what the source material hits you with. It doesn't ease into it with negotiations or strategy. It starts with this absolute, non-negotiable demand. And for the philosophy of the New Science, this isn't just a wish or a goal, it's the only morally acceptable first move. But to really get why it's so absolute, we need to understand the thinking behind it.
So, okay, an immediate ceasefire. How do you even get there from where we are now? To understand this really uncompromising starting point, we first have to explore the philosophical foundation that it's all built on.
At the very heart of this entire proposal is a worldview the author calls the New Science of Humanity. It's all about reframing how we think about the value of human life itself. And honestly, getting a handle on this one idea is the key to unlocking every other part of the argument.
Now, what's really interesting here is how simple and powerful this idea is. According to the source, what makes us human, our ability to think, to create new knowledge, to build things, also makes us the most noble form of life. And if you accept that single premise, everything else just follows. If human life is the most valuable thing there is, then preserving it has to be the highest priority, above politics, above borders, above everything.
And this is where the author draws a really sharp line in the sand. On one hand, you've got this idea of noble humanity, with all this incredible potential for thought and creation. But on the other hand, the author claims people can be shaped by big societal ideas, things like patriotism or loyalty to the state, into what they call man-made cognitive animals. In that state, people are pushed to sacrifice their own lives, which this philosophy says is the ultimate value, for these abstract ideas. Ideas the author literally calls products of humanity's childhood.
And this quote just cuts right to the heart of the urgency. The argument is that even if a person is living in that so-called cognitive animal state, they still have the potential to realize their own inherent worth. But death extinguishes that potential forever. So from this viewpoint, there's no cause, no border, no political goal that can possibly justify the permanent loss of even one human life. And that is why a ceasefire isn't a suggestion, it's a moral mandate.
Okay, so let's see how this philosophy actually diagnoses the conflict. If preserving life is the absolute highest value, then why on earth does the fighting continue? The source text offers an answer that shifts the focus away from nations and zooms in on the individuals who lead them.
This is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's the bridge from this high-level philosophy to the brutal reality of the war. The source argues that the reasons we usually hear for why the war must go on, well, they aren't the real drivers behind the decisions being made. The text points to several justifications for the war that it flat-out calls pretexts. Things like patriotism for borders that might only be a few decades old, or fighting for huge concepts like democracy or against dictatorship, which the author says don't really have precise definitions that everyone agrees on anyway. The argument here is that these are the public rationales, but they're masking a deeper, much more personal motivation. And here we have it. This is the core diagnosis according to the source. The conflict keeps going not because of these grand ideals, but because decision-makers on both sides have allegedly blended their own personal interests with the interests of the entire nation. The war continues, it argues, because it serves the private needs of those in power. Now, to make this point really concrete, the author uses a very specific example. The text states that for the Ukrainian leadership, choosing peace wouldn't just be a tough political move, it would put them in grave danger. This personal threat, the author argues, becomes a primary roadblock to ending the war. It effectively turns a leader's personal security problem into a nation's reason to keep fighting. So, if the problem is that the private interests of leaders are prolonging the war, what's the fix? The source lays out what it calls a professional peace proposal, and it's designed to solve this exact problem head-on. The author's take on past diplomatic efforts is sharp. They're basically dismissed as not being professional enough. And why? Because in this view, they failed to see and deal with the real obstacle, the personal stakes of the leaders. They were treating the symptoms, like disagreements over land, instead of the disease, which is supposedly the leader's private interests. So the proposed solution is a pretty direct two-step process. First, you have to just say it out loud. You have to explicitly acknowledge that the personal safety and private interests of the leaders are a central issue, not a side note, but a primary problem.
Second, you have to make a public, explicit promise to guarantee the security of the top leaders on both sides. The whole point is to take that personal risk completely out of the equation.
And these guarantees are not vague. The text is very specific about what needs to be secured for these leaders to feel safe enough to even consider peace. This includes their reputation, their financial interests, their money, and a safe place for them to live after the conflict is over. The idea is to make peace a personally survivable and safe option for them.
So, after going through all that, what's the big takeaway here? You know, whether you agree with this proposal or not, it definitely forces us to look at conflict through a very different lens. It's a lens that puts individual human life above all else, and it closely examines the personal motivations of those in power.
So when you boil it all down, here's the provocative thesis. The text argues that the fastest, most effective way to peace isn't through traditional diplomacy about territory or ideology. It's by directly addressing and neutralizing the personal risks faced by the very people who have the power to stop the fighting. And that leaves us with a really challenging question to think about. This entire analysis hinges on the idea that those two things, national interest and personal interest, can get dangerously tangled. It asks us to think critically about what truly motivates geopolitical conflict, and to really question where we draw the line between what's good for a nation and what's good for its leaders. Thanks for watching.